DLCs across the Souls games are known to be the best areas and just best part of those games as a whole. And since I've played and beaten every DLC at least twice, I figured it's finally time to rank every single DLC from worst to best. And let me let you know, since every single DLC is so good, even the ones at the very bottom of this list are still extraordinary areas and most likely one of the best areas in their game. And before we get started, make sure to like and subscribe. Also, just let me know in the comments any of your opinions, so what you disagree with, what you agree with, and whatever thoughts or ideas that get sparked from this video, just let me know in the comments. And now it's time to finally start the video. And coming in the last spot / 8th place is the crown of the Ivory King. And even though this is last place, I still think this is a fabulous area with a great concept on how to get through this area. Firstly, you are greeted with a boss that you most likely cannot fight or beat because he is invisible. So your first goal is to be able to see him. So you have to go throughout the area and collect this eye to see him. And then after that, you can basically fight the main boss after, defrost the ice. But the problem is there's so many enemies down there with the boss that your new task is to go ahead throughout the area and collect knights. So there's so many different branches and paths that you can go out and explore throughout this area to help you beat that boss, which is completely optional, which who doesn't love that? But there is one more boss and one more main area of this DLC that I haven't talked about, which is basically a copy and paste of the first boss, but they added 2 of them. And not only is it just basically a copy and paste, but he looks a little different, the area itself is super, super bad. And if we're being honest, that little section right there might be the worst area in Dark Souls Remastered, in Dark Souls 2. It is such a pain, it is so annoying. There's really nothing fun about that area, but obviously on the bright side, it is completely optional, and it's a very minor-ish part of the DLC. It's like an add-on to the DLC, which a lot of people aren't even going to notice and do it, so take it with a grain of salt. But even with that, there's still so many great things going for this DLC, such as that silly invader who transforms into those objects and follows you around till you get to a chest and he just tries to backstab you, which is super cool. I love the little hedgehog area. I like those mages who aren't really active till you talk to that one NPC who unfreezes the ice. Then they start and try to kill you, which allows for tons of variety in this area and allows you to replay it with totally different outcomes and experiences. And I also like those giants that are completely frozen until you kill somebody near them and it activates them, and they are super scary and such a pain, but obviously you can kind of control if they get activated or not. The last great thing I love about this DLC as a whole is obviously I love the vibe. It's super icy, it's super cool, it's a very memorable and unique area, and the final boss of this DLC is so awesome. He is such a spectacle, it's such a hyped fight, and he's just so fun to fight. And I am saying so many absolutely great things right now, but he's still at the bottom of the list, and that's just because all the DLCs are so awesome and such a step up and upgrade from the base game that they're all going to be fabulous, but one of them had to be last, and I guess progressing through the areas isn't as fun as the rest of the DLCs are. And coming up right after that is the Ashes of Ariandel DLC from Dark Souls 3. Now this DLC starts off as a relatively biggish area that is totally open with wolves, those giant Vikings, and one giant wolf. It is pretty empty, but there are still lots of little pockets to explore. But once you get to the second half, that is definitely where it ramps up and gets a lot better in terms of just the area connectivity and just how you go through the area. It's a lot more complex and it's a lot more fun. And if we're being quite honest, this DLC is definitely carried to a certain extent by its main boss, which is, Sister Fried. Now this boss fight is not only such a spectacle, it's not only super fun, but it's super hard and super fair. And there are 3 phases in this boss fight that are each equally as fun, as hard, and as adrenaline packed. But this DLC definitely has a lot less content than most of them, and it's definitely a lot shorter than most other DLCs. And the other boss in this DLC is not so fun. It's really just a regular NPC with a giant wolf, which, it's not like a horrible boss fight, but for a DLC, and especially after fighting a boss as good as Sister Fried, it is definitely a giant letdown. And although I do really love the snowy vibe, it's very similar to the DLC beforehand. It's like everything's frozen and snowy, and although I do really love it, this DLC is just way too short. There's not enough content, and especially for how much it costed, it wasn't really as worth it as the other DLCs. So that's why I think it's pretty fair to put it in this spot. Also, I think this spot and the last spot, they're pretty interchangeable. And now for my 6th spot, which I think might be a Terrywinkle, whatever you want to say, of a hot take, and that is going to be the Artorias of the Abyss DLC. Now, I really do love, I just love this DLC as a whole, but if we're being honest, exploring the areas isn't that crazy. It's very linear, it's very simple, the levels aren't really that intricate. The enemies, for the most part, are pretty basic and simple and easy, besides those like one giant stone guardians, which I really do enjoy, and I think they are very underrated. But there's like low-key not a lot of armor to collect, not a lot of weapons to collect, not a lot of quest lines to do. I mean, I don't even know if there's like one quest line to do here. There's not much to do inside these areas besides kill the enemies and progress forward. There's like no puzzles, no items to really scavenge for, which obviously makes going through the DLC a little bit worse. Now, I know it sounds like I'm doing a lot of complaints, but it is still very fun to go throughout this DLC, especially because there's four whole bosses in this DLC, and they are all very, very good, especially for Dark Souls Remastered standards. These 4 bosses in this DLC are probably all top 7 in the regular game. Like, if you were to compare all Dark Souls Remastered bosses, all 4 from this DLC, I'm putting in my top 7. And those bosses in this DLC include the Sanctuary Guardian, which I think is super underrated. People kind of just take him as like a throwaway introduction boss, but low-key, this guy is super intricate, and his designs, like the way he attacks, is really cool how it's based off your movement if you got hit by previous other attacks. I really like that guy. I think he's really underrated. And the other 3 bosses really speak for themselves. Artorias, Manus, and Calmeet. I mean, everyone loves those bosses, and for good reason. They're super cool, they're super fun, and they're super good for their time. I also do think the DLC picks up in the second half after Artorias. I think the area is a lot more memorable and unique, and I think it comes with a certain complexity to it. It's nothing crazy, but there's like a couple paths you can take at certain instances. There's a couple ways you can go about progressing through the area, and there's definitely some strategy to, like, you know, avoiding those like dark orb casters, which I do think is pretty fun. But in overall terms, this DLC is not the best, it's not the worst, it's slightly below average compared to all the DLCs, and that's why it is taking this spot. And now it's time for the 5th spot, which I'm gonna have to give to the Crown of the Old Iron King, which, let me just tell you, firstly, I love the way this area is built. I think this is probably the most intricate, or like one of the most intricate levels in Souls game history, just throughout all the Souls games, because it's so fun progressing through a giant tower. Basically, what happens is you start at the tippity top of a giant, humongous tower, and by the end of the DLC, you're going to be at the bottom fighting a very cool boss. And by the way, the Fume Knight, the boss at the end of this DLC, which I just said was very cool, is probably the best boss in Dark Souls 2 in my opinion. He's not like a crazy spectacle to look at, but the gameplay is so fluid and so fun, and it's one of those fights where if you die, it is your fault, and it's just such a fun fight to master once you really get the hang of it. Now, this DLC has such a different feel from all the other DLCs and just areas as a whole, because it's just super unique in like the sense that you're literally just progressing downwards, or usually it's a linear path or maybe even upwards. Like, the whole entire point of this is to be slowly progressing downwards. And there's not really a crazy unique gimmick, besides there's these like fire statues which will buff the enemies a lot. So like, you're not going to stagger them, you're not going to do a lot of damage, and they're going to do a shit ton of damage to you. So you definitely want to aim for those, but it's not like a necessity, so it just adds a little bit of complexity. And progressing through the areas, there are so many different paths you can take, so many different ways you can go about it, because there's tons of like elevators going up and down in several different spots, which I think is super cool. Adds to the chaoticness, because there's a lot of chaoticness in this area, but I kind of like it. But at first, the tower is pretty lifeless, and there's not much to do besides progress to the midpoint, where you have to take a detour to another big tower, which is not crazy big, where you have to deal with these exploding little turd guys and collect an item to make the elevator start working, which really brings a lot of life to the area, and just makes it so there's so many different paths and things to do now. So yeah, I just really love that area, and now it's on to the next, which I'm pretty sure is going to be 4th place, right? And now, this is going to be probably my first relatively decent hot take. This is nothing crazy, but I think the 4th spot goes to the last and final DLC of Dark Souls 2 that I have not talked about, which is the Poison DLC, aka the Shulva Sanctum City. I think I said that right. But low-key, this area, I mean, just DLC as a whole, is so underrated, and I think that is due to the fact of its bosses. If we're being honest here, the bosses aren't so good. I mean, Dark Souls 2 bosses as a whole aren't so good, but the other 2 DLCs have really good bosses, whereas this one, there's 2 bosses that are pretty decent, and there's 1 boss that kind of sucks. So I think that's what makes people dislike it. But I low-key think Dark Souls 2 isn't a game that focuses on its bosses. Dark Souls 2 is a game that focuses on its areas. And I think the enjoyment from Dark Souls 2 is within its areas and the struggles and challenges from its areas. And I feel like once you notice that, you're going to like Dark Souls 2 a lot more. Because Dark Souls 3's challenges are definitely from its bosses and not its areas, which makes people think and judge it based off the bosses. Or for Dark Souls 2, I think you should judge it based on the areas, and I think Shulva Sanctum City is a prime and perfect example from that. The areas are super challenging, but they are super skill required. The enemies are hard, the enemies are fun, and just the level design is so intricate and unique here. And when I say that, I really mean that. I think this area is the best designed area, not only in Dark Souls 2, but definitely top 3 in Souls games history. Basically, you're at the top of a giant, like, fucking city, and it's not like a super downwards path like, the Ivory King one is, but you're, like, slowly descending downwards as you progress through this, like, city. There's, like, so many different paths you can take, but I think it's such a strategical area. Like, there's these things where you hit that moves platforms, so there's so many platforms you can move, and so many ways you can go about going throughout this area. And there's just, like, I don't know, it's so fucking cool, and at a certain point, you reach all the way to the bottom, where this water thing is, and that's where you activate, like, you activate this elevator, so where you get into the main fucking castle tower, which is a full-on descent from there. So I just think the progression and the way you go throughout this DLC is so fucking good, bro. Especially that midway part where there's so many different puzzles, such as those, like, invisible guys, which are fucking super strong. They're gonna fuck you up. They have so much health. You can't, like, stagger them. They're hard to, like, tell if they're there, and they're super scary, but they have a little gimmick where they're in a crypt, and you gotta find their crypt and break it, so you can make them human, and so you can kill them relatively easy. There's also these, like, spikes on the floor that will fuck you up unless you figure out how to deal with those, and there's, like, more, like, spinning, moving platforms throughout this entire DLC that lead to, like, secret items and crystal lizards, and it's just, like, so fun because there's so much content and so much items and weapons and armor hidden throughout this DLC, and there's, like, a puzzle to find each and every single one of them, which I just love. And now it is time for the top 3, the big 3, whatever you want to call it, and coming in the 3rd place is going to be the Bloodborne DLC. Now, low-key, this could be a little bit of a hot take, but the top 3 are honestly on the same level. I would say that the Dark Souls 3 DLC and the Elden Ring DLC are better, but, like, you could slightly interchange them. I mean, I think there's a noticeable difference, but they are on the same level, so I don't think it's that crazy to put it here. And holy fucking voice crack. And let's be honest, Old Hunters does absolutely carry Bloodborne, and it is a absolutely fabulous and fantastic DLC that just kind of revolutionized the early Dark Souls games. And this DLC brought so much new content, and it's just overall so huge. You got 11 new trick weapons, which is absolutely massive, because it's not like 11 weapons from a Dark Souls game. These weapons are all super unique, and there's a lot, like, fewer of them. I mean, the areas here are obviously just awesome. It is a blast traversing through all of them. They're all super intricate, super fun. They all have pretty great enemies. There's a couple annoying enemies, but for the most part, they are all absolutely fabulous. But if we're being honest, the one enemy that absolutely carries them all is the Old Hunters. These guys are just an absolute blast to fight. I low-key at first thought they were going to be pretty unfun, because a lot of PvP are, like, NPC encounters aren't low-key that fun. Like, they kind of just spam and stuff like that. But these guys had the right amount of spam so you could take them seriously, but not enough to where it gets overly annoying. These guys are just an absolute blast to fight. And if we're talking about the Bloodborne DLC, you cannot forget to mention its absolutely stunning, fun, and just crazy bosses, aka Ludwig and Orphan of Cause, and Lady Maria, which are all just super iconic, hard, and fun fights that we'll probably always remember. And as much as you want to glaze Bloodborne and its DLC, there still is the living failures, so you gotta take the good with the bad. There is some down parts to this DLC, but low-key, that's probably the only bad thing in this DLC. And I also love, like, how this DLC and Dark Souls Remastered DLC, you kind of are affected by what you do in the other world in this world. So, I mean, not world, like, the main game to the DLC. Like, there's little details which, if you do in the DLC, it will affect the regular game and vice versa, which I do really like, and I think a lot of the other DLCs don't really touch up on as well as Bloodborne does. And now it is finally time for the top 2. And coming in 2nd place is going to be the Ringed DLC in Dark Souls 3. One of the best DLCs, I mean, it's probably the 2nd best DLC I've ever played. Now, the main problem I've had with Dark Souls 3 as a whole for most of the entirety of the game is I never really liked the areas that much. Some areas I flat out just hated, and it was just an unpleasant time going through them. In some areas I was just like, I didn't really like them that much. I wasn't really looking forward to going through the areas. I was just kind of like, okay, let me just fight the boss. But for this DLC, I actually enjoyed going through the areas. I actually wanted to explore the areas more. I wanted to collect most of the items and branch through different paths and shit like that. I actually loved going through the areas for this DLC, which is why it makes me rank it so much higher. I would have expected this to just be 3 great bosses and kind of a throwaway for the rest of it. But, Dragkeep is still a pretty fun area, and once you get to the Ring City, it's just so beautiful, it's so fun. The enemies here are an absolute blast, because they're just so unique. They're all super dangerous, and they're all super fun, and you have to have different, encounters and ways of going about fighting them. And obviously, if you mention the enemies, you have to mention the Ringed Knights, which are just one of my favorite enemies in the Souls series. They're so cool, they're so hard, and they're so fun. And if we're going back to talk about the bosses They really went 3 for 3. I mean, the 4th boss, I really wouldn't consider bad, but I wouldn't, like, consider it in the same category as those bosses, because that was meant to be, like, a little fun PvP/Covenant encounter, not, like, a super serious boss. But the main 3 bosses they worked on here were, they were so good. Firstly, the Demon Princes. That is such a flawlessly executed boss. I mean, first off, that giant fall is so cool. The bosses themselves look like they'd overwhelm you and shit on you, but it's super fair, it's super balanced, it's super fun. And obviously, Madeira is a super cool boss fight. I think it is a little bit overrated, but I still love it. And then Gale, my sweet, beautiful Gale. He is so cool. He is so fun. I just love that guy. But yeah, this DLC was super hard. Probably the hardest compared... Actually, no, I'm not going to say that, because Elden Ring's DLC is definitely the hardest. But this DLC was probably the second hardest for me. But for good reason. I felt it was all fair when I died. And low-key, I was happy that I died. I was happy I could come up with, like, new solutions and new ways of getting around the problems that I faced. And with every single DLC besides one ranked, I think you guys know what it's going to be. And that is probably... not probably. It is fucking Shadow of the Erdtree. And something that I do find a little bit weird, and something that I think... And the one kind of crazy thing about this DLC is I think this is the only DLC across all the Souls games that is respectively, and in my opinion, worse than the base game. I think the base game of Elden Ring is actually better than the DLC, whereas I think the opposite. I think Bloodborne's DLC is way better than its base game. Dark Souls 3's DLCs are a little bit better than its game. Dark Souls 2's DLCs are way better than its base game. This is the only one where I actually feel the DLC is worse than its base game. But Elden Ring's base game is so fucking good, where that doesn't really mean much. If it's even relatively close to Elden Ring's base game, it's so good. And yes, I am an Elden Ring meat rider, but I think there is good reason for it. But back to the actual DLC. First off, there is just so much content, which is obviously what you want out of a DLC. If you're paying like an extra $20-$40, you want there to be a lot of shit. And let me tell you, this isn't quite a second game, but this is probably like a whole 60% as big as Elden Ring's base game. There is so much shit to do here, and it's all like content filled. You think a lot of it is just throwaway land, which I will admit a little bit is, but there's still like underground areas, fucking dungeons and shit like that, and it's just all so much content, so much items to collect. There's even new weapon types. Like, that's fucking awesome. There's so much shit to do here. So many cool bosses. Yes, there's probably a couple kind of throwaway enemy bosses, but the actual bosses here, like Mesmer, Rilana, and that lion guy is just all so fucking cool. And Bale. Bale's a great guy. I don't know how I forgot about that guy. But yeah, unlike the other DLCs, there's not like a set way to explore. It's not like you're just going down, you're going up. It's a straightforward linear path. It's not like you're necessarily put in the middle and there's just like you can go anywhere. But it is kind of like that. There's just a total of like, 7 different types of areas that are all just huge and so different. And you can just kind of explore them all freely for the most part. And you would have thought out of all the different types of areas Elden Ring has already made that there would be a lot of repeat shit and like shit that looks the exact same. But no, there's like the Cerulean Coast, which is like all blue grass. There's like that not the Eleanor ruins, but like that Rahan ruins or whatever, and it's just so fucking beautiful, man. Like every single area in the DLC is low-key more beautiful than the base game, and I found that to be very surprising. But yeah, the enemies here, the bosses here, the areas here, the items here, everything here is so fucking awesome. So yeah, that's basically it for this video. If you guys like the rankings, make sure to like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.